The autumn wind whispered softly across the marble gravestones, carrying with it the scent of wilted roses and memories too heavy to bear.
Charlotte stood before the grave of her only son, Andrew, her heart an empty vessel carved hollow by grief.
3 years had passed since the car crash that took him away, yet every visit felt like reopening the wound all over again.
She was a woman who once commanded boardrooms and shaped empires with her words. But in front of this grave, she was just a mother, broken, silent, and lost.
That morning, she expected solitude, the quiet company of her thoughts, and perhaps the comfort of whispering to the wind. But as she approached the familiar headstone in a Boston cemetery, she froze. There was someone there, a young woman kneeling beside Andrew's grave, clutching a small girl in her arms, her body trembling as if her soul were unraveling.
The woman's sobs were raw, unrestrained, echoing through the cemetery. Her long, dark hair cascaded over her face as she pressed a trembling hand to the cold stone.
The little girl in her arms, no more than 2 years old, looked around with wide, curious eyes, clutching a small stuffed bear.
Charlotte's pulse quickened. She didn't know this woman, and yet something about the sight of her felt wrong, or perhaps too right.
Gathering her courage, she stepped closer, her heels crunching softly against the gravel path.
The sound made the young woman turn abruptly, her face streaked with tears, eyes wide with panic.
For a long moment, they simply stared at one another. Two mothers, bound by something neither could yet understand.
Charlotte's eyes fell upon the flowers laid carefully at the base of the grave. Fresh lilies, her son's favorite. She hadn't brought any today.
Whoever this woman was, she had beaten her to it. Confusion rippled through her chest, mingled with the faint sting of jealousy.
"Who are you?" she wanted to ask, but the words never escaped her lips. The little girl in the woman's arms reached out a tiny hand, brushing against the gravestone, babbling softly in Spanish.
The woman whispered something in return, something that made her voice tremble like a candle in the wind. Charlotte felt her throat tighten.
The young woman, whose name she would later learn was Jessica, began to speak haltingly through her tears. Charlotte listened, each word landing like raindrops on dry earth.
She said she didn't mean to intrude, that she had come to thank the man who was buried here. Her accent was thick, her voice fragile but sincere.
Jessica said that 3 years ago she had been 8 months pregnant, living in a small apartment in Glasgow, abandoned by the child's father and too poor to survive.
One cold night, when she was at her lowest, she had received an email from an unknown donor, a man named Andrew, offering to pay for her hospital bills and housing through a charitable foundation.
He had read her story online, she said, and his act of generosity had saved her and her unborn child. Charlotte's breath caught in her chest. Andrew? Her Andrew?
He had been working on a philanthropic startup, helping struggling single mothers across the world, a project she'd once dismissed as idealistic nonsense.
Now, as she looked at Jessica, holding the child he had unknowingly saved, Charlotte realized that her son's kindness had rippled far beyond what she ever knew.
Jessica continued, her eyes shimmering. She said she had traveled all the way to New England after discovering that Andrew had passed.
She needed to say thank you in person to the man who had never met her but had changed her fate.
Tears blurred Charlotte's vision as she took a step closer, her heart twisting between pain and awe.
She remembered the endless nights she had sat in Andrew's room after his death, wishing for a sign that his life had mattered. Now, standing in front of Jessica and her little girl, Alice, she realized the sign had come.
Alice's bright blue eyes glimmered in the sunlight, a color so familiar it sent shivers down Charlotte's spine.
They were the same eyes her son once had. For a fleeting second, she felt as if Andrew was staring back at her through that innocent child.
The grief that once crushed her began to shift, transforming into something gentler, a quiet ache mingled with gratitude.
She invited Jessica to walk with her through the cemetery garden, and as they did, they shared their stories.
Charlotte spoke of Andrew's brilliance, his laughter, the day she lost him. Their steps were slow, their silence heavy, yet healing.
Jessica spoke of loneliness, of courage, of how one man's kindness had restored her faith in humanity. In the days that followed, Charlotte found herself thinking constantly about Jessica and little Alice. She invited them to her home one afternoon, unsure of why, perhaps to fill the silence that had consumed her life since Andrew's passing. The sight of the little girl toddling through the house, laughing and touching everything, brought warmth to rooms that had long forgotten joy. Jessica, though humble and hesitant, began to smile again. For the first time in years, Charlotte felt needed. She helped Charlotte cook, cleaned without being asked, and spoke about her dreams of finding work, of building a life for her daughter. She found herself teaching Jessica English, showing Alice old photo albums of Andrew, and slowly a bond began to form, not of blood, but of heart. The cold, withdrawn businesswoman who once only spoke in boardroom terms now laughed at a child's jokes and shared meals with someone who reminded her what humanity truly meant. Neighbors began to notice the change in Charlotte. But one evening, while sorting through Andrew's old files, Charlotte found something that made her hands tremble.
A letter addressed to her, dated just days before his death. Tears streamed down Charlotte's face as she held the letter to her chest. She knew then what she had to do.
In it, Andrew wrote about a project he had started, sponsoring single mothers anonymously, and mentioned a woman from Spain who was about to give birth alone. "Mom," he wrote, "if anything ever happens to me, please promise me you'll continue helping people like her, because kindness should never die with the person who gives it." She reached out to her legal team, setting up a foundation in Andrew's name to support struggling mothers across the world. She made Jessica its first employee, not out of charity, but out of belief in her strength, her resilience, and in the way fate had intertwined their lives. Together, they worked tirelessly to grow the foundation, with little Alice always running around the office, her laughter echoing like a song of hope. Years later, on the anniversary of Andrew's passing, Charlotte returned to the cemetery once again. This time she wasn't alone. Jessica stood beside her, holding Alice's hand. They placed white lilies on the grave, just as Andrew had once loved. The child looked up at Charlotte and said softly, "Grandma, is this where Daddy Andrew sleeps?" The words pierced her heart, but they also filled it with light. She smiled through her tears and whispered, "Yes, sweetheart, and he's watching over all of us." Charlotte stood beneath the golden leaves, the wind rushing gently through her silver hair. As Alice's laughter danced through the air, she realized that though grief had once broken her, love had quietly rebuilt her. In the presence of a woman her son once helped, and a child who carried his light,
she found peace.
And as the sun dipped low behind the trees, it painted the world in soft amber hues, a silent reminder that even in death, kindness lives on.